Hey, so I've decided to do a series on the parables of Jesus, and I want to look at some of the parables that Jesus gave and just, basically go through them. What do they mean? How do we break them down? And so in doing that, there's a certain thing that we have to understand about the way that you study parables. When you look at a parable, what you really want to look at is almost shock factor. Like, what was Jesus trying to say? What's the main thing? Because not every single detail in a parable is going to relate to something. You can't make everything match up. There's no analogy that's just 100% perfect. So to kick things off, we're going to look at one of the first parables that Jesus gave, and it's the parable of the new cloth and the new wineskins, or putting new wine into old wineskins, that parable. So this parable is found in Matthew 9, Mark 2, and also Luke 5. It's one of the few parables that's actually in all three of the synoptic gospels. And it's essentially word for word in the same in all of them, with a few minor differences here and there. Nothing in that would affect anything. And even the surrounding events are very similar coming into this parable. But Luke adds an extra verse at the end of the parable, and since he has kind of the most complete picture of the parable, we're going to use his text to discuss this parable. So this is Luke chapter 5, verses 33 to 39. And then they said to him, "Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink?" And he, Jesus, said to them, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days." And then he spoke a parable to them. "No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise, the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says, the old is better." So in order to look at this parable about the wineskins, we have to look at the question of fasting, because that's the question that led Jesus to give this parable. And so first thing we want to say is, where did this question come from? Well, you have to look at all three versions of the parable in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in order to figure out who is asking the question. And the question actually comes from both the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees. If you only read the passage here in Luke, it almost makes it seem like the Pharisees are asking this question, but it's actually coming from the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees. And so they're basically asking, hey, how come we fast, but your disciples don't fast? Like, why are we having to give up food, but your disciples just get to eat and drink and do whatever? That doesn't seem right to us. So Jesus responds by saying that you don't have to fast when the bridegroom is present. You see, the Pharisees had gone ahead and made this law, not something given by God, but the Pharisees made this law that said, if you're celebrating a joyous occasion, then even if you're in a mandated fast or you have given yourself to a fast to God, that joyous occasion supersedes the fast, and you don't have to fast. So basically, you go to a wedding, you get a party like a rock star, eat and drink all you want, even if you're on a fast, it doesn't matter. And that's what the Pharisees said. So Jesus kind of takes their own language and throws it back at them, and he says, hey, when the bridegroom is present, the disciples won't fast. But when he's gone, then they will fast. See, Jesus wasn't against fasting, but he's making a statement. He's directly saying he's the bridegroom. And they would have understood that he was saying he's the Messiah. He was going to be the bridegroom to the church. And so he is openly declaring that he's the Messiah here. But that's not really the point of what we're doing. We're not talking about fasting. We're not talking about whether you should or shouldn't fast. We're talking about new wine and old wineskins. So let's jump onto that. So the next thing we have to ask ourselves is, what prompted this question in the first place? If you go back and read from the beginning of the chapter, and you can pick Matthew, Mark, or Luke, it doesn't matter, what you'll find is that Jesus is in the midst of picking his disciples. So he's already picked the first few of his disciples. And when he gets to Levi, which we all know is Matthew, Levi goes ahead and organizes this giant feast to celebrate being chosen by Jesus and to become one of his disciples. And at this feast, there would be John's disciples, some Pharisees, some of the Pharisees' disciples, Jesus, and the first few picks of Jesus' disciples. So we've got Peter, Andrew, Matthew, James, and John. Matthew being the most recent pick. And so these people are all at this feast at Matthew's house. And the Pharisees kick things off by saying that what they're doing is they're criticizing Jesus for even being at this party, which also they're at. And they're accusing him of eating with sinners and tax collectors. And Jesus said, he deals with that. He explains, hey, I didn't come for the sick. It's not the sick that needed, or it's not the healed. It's not the well that need a doctor. It's the sick that need a doctor. And so I'm here, for sinners. And so Jesus deals with that first. And then they come into this question about fasting. And this is what has prompted the question is essentially they're judging the people that Jesus has picked to be his disciples. So basically what they're doing is they're saying, hey, listen, we fast, John's disciples fast, the Pharisees fast, the disciples of the Pharisees fast. But we've noticed that the guys that you pick, they don't seem to be fasting. Why wouldn't they fast? Why did you pick them? Obviously, they're not the most religious of the pack. We've got people over here fasting and praying and doing all the stuff, but your guys, they're not doing that. They're not giving themselves over to fasting like we have. Why would you pick them? You didn't pick the most obvious people. You didn't pick the ones who are already doing all of the religious elements. And that's the real question that they're asking. They're not asking, why aren't they fasting? They're asking Jesus, why would you pick people that we deem as unqualified? And it's at that point when they're criticizing Jesus's pick for his disciples that Jesus lays down this parable. And he says, no one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise, the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. So what is Jesus talking about here? Well, I've heard it said that Jesus is talking about trying to apply grace to the law. Like if you're trying to mix the new covenant and the old covenant, and the new covenant is grace and the old covenant is law, and if you try to mix them, it doesn't work. But honestly, that doesn't make sense given the context and the reason why the Pharisees, or why the disciples of the Pharisees and the disciples of John are asking this question. In context, Jesus is actually defending his pick of the disciples. He's saying that the disciples are new wineskins. Basically, the people are wineskins. People raised in the religious teachings of the Pharisees are old wineskins. And the people that don't have that upbringing, his disciples, who were not overly religious, are new wineskins. And that the old teaching, which is what the Pharisees teach, fit in very well with the old wineskins. But what Jesus has is brand new teaching. New wine is equal to new teaching, and it needs to go into new wineskins. Because the people who have the old wine and the old wineskins are going to reject the new wine. That's what he's saying when he says that it's going to burst the wineskin, or that the cloth will tear away and ruin the garment, is that his new teachings are not going to mix with the old teaching, and those that are brought up under the religious system are going to reject the new teaching. So when Jesus picked disciples, he picked people that weren't already filled up with the old teaching and the religious structure that the Pharisees were given. This is also supported by this next verse in Luke, where he says, and no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires the new, for he says the old is better. You see, Jesus is basically outright prophesying the future, indicating that the Pharisees, which are the old wineskins, are going to reject his teaching or his new wine in favor of the old covenant, which, of course, does happen. They completely reject him. In fact, they go so far as to crucify him because he's bursting their old wineskins. You can't mix his teaching of the new covenant with the Pharisaical religious law. So kind of the question that we want to come to is, how does this apply to us today? Okay, so that makes sense. Jesus defended his pick of disciples. But if everything in the Bible is timeless and can be applicable to my life today, what lessons can I draw from that? Well, the first thing is we don't want to be old wineskins. We are not trained by Pharisees. So how do we become an old wineskin? Well, it's simple. If we get into legalism or salvation by works or sanctification by works, then we're operating under an old covenant principle, which is that you have to earn your right standing before God through keeping the law. That's what legalism is. While we're not keeping the Mosaic law or whatever else, we basically have set up a standard of rules where we've said, if I just do these things, then God will be pleased with me. And if I don't do these other things, God will be displeased with me. And so we're trying to earn favor of God. But we need to be under the new covenant and have a New Testament mindset. That will keep us from rejecting the teachings of Jesus. So a way to tell if you have an Old Testament mindset or an Old Covenant mindset is to ask yourself, are you righteous? See, under the new covenant, our righteousness is determined not from our works, but rather it comes from faith. So those who believe are counted as righteous. Jesus traded his righteousness for our unrighteousness. So he gave us, our righteousness is imputed to us from God himself. And so we have the righteousness of Jesus, and it's not based on our works. It is based on our relationship with Jesus. So if you have a hard time viewing yourself as righteous, then you still have an old covenant mindset. And you're going to have a hard time accepting even a teaching like this that says you are righteous. In fact, you kind of recoil at it and you think, I can't be righteous. I'm not worthy. But that's not what Jesus says. That's not what Paul says. That's not what the entire New Testament says. It says that you are worthy. God made you worthy, and he's the one who justified you. He's the one who sanctified you, and he's the one who will glorify you. So he's doing it all. And if we can't accept that, it might mean that we have an Old Testament mindset, that we are basically old wineskins and we're rejecting the new teachings of Jesus. But let's not do that. Let's look at what Jesus is actually saying and receive his teaching, because his teachings are good and his teachings bring us life and his teachings bring us victory. So, okay, that's it for this parable. I think I probably covered that enough. If you want to see some other teachings, you can visit our YouTube channel. I'll try to stick a link down below. And then, or just go to rebornjacks.com, visit our website. We've got all of our social media links on there. And I will see you next week. Bye.